So, you finally showed your true colors. The words sliced through the intercom, echoing down the marbled corridor like a verdict before a trial. It wasn't the first time someone had spoken to Leona Mercer without seeing her. That was the estate's way. Voices detached from faces, commands issued from behind oak doors. But this accusation landed differently. Cold, sharp, humiliating, and public. The night before, she'd passed the vault hallway and found the door slightly ajar, a thin crack of light leaking across the marble floor like a broken promise. She'd paused, long enough to frown, but not long enough to be foolish. That hallway had rules, silent ones, and she'd learned them quickly. She remembered Evelyn's voice from her first week. "Some doors aren't meant for the help, Miss Mercer. Just keep to your path." And she had. Until now. The breakfast trays were still warm in her hands when the voice snapped through the intercom, summoning her. Not to the parlor, not to the kitchen, straight to the vault. Her heart pounded. Her hands stayed still. She placed the tray on the nearest table and walked, not rushed, not hesitant, to where her presence had been requested and condemned in the same breath. Ashbourne Estate, in the late spring sun, gleamed like a polished relic from another time. From the gardens to the grand staircase, every corner seemed to whisper history. But in this moment, it felt like a stage one where she'd been cast without warning in a role no one wanted to play. She reached the vault hallway. Charles Harrow stood waiting. No greeting, no pretense, just eyes that flickered with something between suspicion and calculation. Behind him, the door to the vault hung wide open. "You were seen here this morning. Alone," he said, voice clipped. "I was delivering linen to the second-floor corridor," she replied, calm. "I passed through, as always." "One bundle's missing. Of cash." He motioned toward the open safe, stacks of currency disturbingly neat, save for one empty space. "And the camera shows you were the only one nearby." She stood still, spine tall. "Then I recommend you check the footage again, sir." He stepped forward, too close. "Don't get clever." The moment held silent, tense. She didn't flinch, not even when he reached out and gripped her wrist. The motion was sudden, aggressive, but controlled. He wasn't losing his temper. He was asserting something. Power. Ownership. Fear. "Let go," she said quietly. Behind them, Jonas King rounded the corner and stopped. His gaze dropped immediately to Charles's hand, then to Leona's face. Not a word. Not a sound. But the hallway changed. Charles released her, stepped back, straightened his tie. "You'll wait in the staff room until I speak with Evelyn," he said flatly. She didn't nod. She didn't blink. She turned and walked away, the weight of silence heavier than any accusation. Back in the corridor outside the staff room, Miss D. Whitaker was refilling flower water. She looked up just once, eyes tired, mouth drawn. "Best stay quiet," she murmured as Leona passed. Leona said nothing. She sat in the farthest chair in the corner, tucked her hands into her lap, and watched the clock tick 1 minute, then 2, then 10. Later, when Jonas found her outside near the greenhouse, pruning old hydrangea stems with slow, methodical movements, he said nothing at first, just knelt nearby, inspecting the soil. "You didn't take anything," he said finally. She didn't look up. "That's not the point." "No, it ain't." The wind shifted. The air smelled of damp earth and memory. Somewhere in the distance, the estate's bell chimed noon. Inside, Charles rewatched the footage 3 times. She was there. But she never stepped into the vault. Never even looked toward the cash. Just walked by, same as always. He paused the frame on her face, still, controlled, innocent, trolled. He tapped his pen once, twice, on the desk. Then, instead of calling her to apologize, he deleted the file from the local machine. In the greenhouse, Jonas stood to leave. "You want the truth?" he asked. She clipped one more branch, slow and precise. "Truth's never free, especially not here." He hesitated. "I'll let you know what I find." As he walked away, she finally let her shoulders slump. Not from fear, from restraint. That evening, after dinner service, she folded linens in the laundry room. Every crease perfect, every towel aligned. A ritual of order in a place where order never protected anyone. The hallway was quiet again. Too quiet. And as she turned off the last light, she whispered not to herself, but to the house. "I see you." Leona rises from the polished floor, trembling from restraint rather than fear, and walks away without a word, her dignity intact, her silence louder than protest. The footage didn't lie, but neither did it explain. Charles Harrow sat alone in the estate's surveillance room, the cold glow from 4 monitors painting his face in pale blues and grays. The air smelled of metal and old wires. His tie hung loosened around his neck, as though even it had lost faith in his composure. Again, he dragged the playback slider back to 06:32 a.m. Watched as Leona Mercer passed the vault room without pause, without hesitation, without theft. She never even looked inside. He leaned back in the creaking leather chair, one hand pressed to his temple. The tension in his jaw betrayed the storm inside him. Not quite remorse, but something close to the edge of it. What was more unnerving than her innocence was the fact that someone else had taken the money. And if she hadn't, who had? Years ago, when he'd first taken over managing parts of the estate under Evelyn's careful instruction, he had installed these cameras to keep everyone honest. He'd said it proudly, with a righteous air, but Jonas had responded with quiet gravity. Sometimes cameras don't keep people honest. They just keep them scared. Charles remembered that now, and he didn't like it. He glanced toward a side monitor showing a locked room deeper in the estate's administrative wing, the old account room. His eyes narrowed. A line from an old audit whispered in his memory, something about budget fluidity and discretionary funds. He pulled open a drawer and removed a beige folder, marked in Evelyn's handwriting. Estate Discretion, Q3, Q4. He didn't open it. Not yet. Outside, the day had warmed, and in the garden, Leona was bent over the rosemary patch, pruning with methodical precision. Dirt lined her gloves. Her apron was damp with the scent of herbs and wet soil. The rhythm of her hands calmed her, gave her the illusion of control. Jonas approached quietly, his boots brushing loose gravel, his presence announced by the faintest cough. "Lavender took well this year," he said. She didn't look up. "Might not last. The roots are shallow." They stood in silence, save for the snip of her shears. Then, without preamble, he said, "I saw the footage. You didn't take it. I knew that. I know you did." He squatted beside her, his knees cracking softly. "But you still got blamed, publicly." She paused, brushed a strand of hair back under her scarf. "It's not new, but it's not going to be ignored either." Jonas looked out toward the hedge line. "You think Charles'll say anything?" "He won't," she said. "Not unless he has to. Not unless it threatens him." Jonas hesitated. "Evelyn's been authorizing transfers. Quiet ones. The kind that don't leave trails. You think this was a mistake? No, Leona said, straightening up. I think it was a test. A test? To see if I'd stay quiet. He studied her. You gonna? She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. Not anymore. She turned to gather the pruned stems, tying them with twine, her hands slow and steady. In her apron pocket, her phone buzzed. She ignored it. It buzzed again. With a sigh, she checked it. Mom, the store's falling apart. Gas company's shutting us off Friday. I hate asking, but we need help. She stared at the message. Not because it shocked her, it didn't, but because it reminded her of what she hadn't said in weeks. She didn't respond. Instead, she placed the phone back in her pocket and returned to tying rosemary. Jonas watched her. You know what they say about this place, don't you? She didn't answer. They say the vault was never about keeping money safe. It was about keeping people afraid. Leona glanced up. Not anymore. That night, Charles sat in the library with the folder open on his lap. Inside were balance sheets, perfectly legal-looking, except for one entry. A $25,000 transfer to something called Ash Renewal Fund. The fund didn't exist, not officially, not in any registry he could access. He pulled out his phone, dialed a number, then stopped before pressing call. After a moment, he shut the folder and placed it in the safe behind the bookshelf. He didn't sleep that night. In her quarters, Leona laid out her notebook. The pages were blank, but for the word she now wrote in blue ink, steady and bold. Ash Renewal Fund. She underlined it. Then she flipped back 2 pages and made a list. Not of suspects, of patterns, odd budget terms, redacted memos, a missing name she'd once seen Sir Bell crossed out on a printed schedule. The silence of the estate pressed around her, the type of silence that wasn't peace, but pressure. When the wind picked up and rustled the shutters, she did not jump. She closed the book gently, blew out the candle beside her bed, and whispered into the dark, You started this. Jonas, in his room above the garage, stared out the window toward the main house. The lights were on in Evelyn's wing. That never meant anything good. Leona looks up from the flowers, the sun catching her eyes, and says softly, Then I'm done staying quiet. There's a reason nobody touches the old parlor on the east wing. It smells like a memory trying to be forgotten. Leona stood just inside the threshold of the room, her hand resting on the faded molding. Dust shimmered in the morning light that filtered through thick velvet curtains. The furniture had been draped in linen for years, giving the space the feel of a mausoleum, elegant, preserved, and profoundly lifeless. She had come looking for silence, but this silence felt intentional, the kind that wrapped around history like gauze around a wound. The estate had layers, each wing a different chapter. The east parlor belonged to Evelyn not in title, but in spirit. It was where decisions were made quietly, often in the presence of bourbon and a fire that rarely burned out before midnight. Once, when Leona was new, she had glimpsed Evelyn seated here late into the evening, staring at the flames as if they whispered to her. She hadn't made a sound, just looked at Leona with that signature glint, half appraisal, half warning. Now, years later, the hearth was cold, the room undisturbed. And yet something drew her in. She moved toward the fireplace, eyes scanning the mantel. A photograph once sat there, a wedding portrait of Charles's parents. It was gone. Instead, tucked behind a brass candlestick, she found an envelope sealed with wax. No name, no markings, just heavy paper and a silence that seemed to thicken when she touched it. She slipped it into her apron and stepped back, heart thudding. That afternoon, the estate prepared for the foundation benefit, a quiet affair for a select few donors who kept Ashbourne's history curated and its secrets buried. Evelyn had summoned Leona to oversee the library's preparation, flower arrangements, bourbon, and the placement of archival photographs. Charles stood in the doorway when she arrived. "I thought I told Miss Whitaker to do this," he said flatly. "She's tending to linens," Leona answered. "I was the next name on the list." He looked at her. Really looked. For the first time in weeks, his voice softened, barely. "You're not afraid of her, are you?" Leona didn't blink. "Should I be?" He stepped aside. She entered the library. She moved slowly, placing each photograph with measured care. Black and white portraits of Harrows long gone stared from gilt frames, a legacy curated to look noble, but underneath the paper was thin. Charles watched from behind his glass of scotch. "You ever think about what this place will be in 50 years?" he asked. "I think about what it used to be, and what it cost." There was a pause. A real one. The kind that dared honesty. He set down his glass. "I found something," he said. "Transfers to a fund that doesn't exist. Evelyn's handwriting. Charles Sr.'s name. But it doesn't match any signature I've seen before." "Forgery?" He nodded. "Possibly. But no way to prove it without making it public. And Evelyn, she doesn't make mistakes," Leona finished for him. "No," he said, "but she erases them." She reached into her apron and handed him the envelope she'd found. This was behind the candlestick in the east parlor. He hesitated, broke the seal. Inside were 3 things: a torn photograph of Clara Wynne, one of the former housekeepers smiling beside a younger Charles Sr., a burned check stub with Clara W. written faintly on it, and a typed letter. "For your silence, for your loyalty, for your own sake, walk away." It wasn't signed. It didn't need to be. Charles's hands trembled slightly as he read. "She knew," he whispered. "She knew everything." Leona felt the walls shift, not physically, but spiritually. The house had been built on generational elegance and controlled narratives. This was a breach. "She paid her to disappear," Leona said. "And when she didn't, they rewrote history." Later that evening, Jonas found Leona by the service entrance, watching the last of the donors' cars disappear into the winding drive. He lit a cigarette, frowned, and said, "Whatever's in that fireplace, you don't want to dig too deep. Some things were meant to stay ash." She looked at him. "Maybe, but some fires don't burn out. They just wait." He nodded, exhaling smoke into the cooling dusk. "Then you'd better be ready for what survives." In her room that night, Leona unfolded a napkin tucked inside the envelope, one she hadn't noticed before. It was stained with bourbon, scribbled with numbers, and bore the faint imprint of a family crest. Evelyn's. She held it to the light. The ink blurred, but the message was clear. A new fund. A new transfer. The date was just 6 weeks ago. 6. She ran her fingers over the crest, then whispered aloud, "How many times have you done this?" Behind her, the wind stirred the curtains, and the estate groaned as if remembering. She didn't sleep. Not because of fear, but because the house had just answered her. She presses the burnt stub between the pages of her notebook and murmurs, "This isn't history. It's evidence." "You always think the worst of me, Charles, but I only ever did what was necessary." Evelyn's voice filled the conservatory like cold perfume, measured, clipped, soaked in superiority. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the glass panels, dappling her silhouette in fractured light. She stood perfectly still beside the rose tree she'd cultivated for nearly a decade, pruning shears in hand like a conductor poised to strike the final note. Charles didn't respond immediately. He was used to his mother's performances. They had rehearsed this tension for years, he, the reluctant heir of a decaying legacy. She, the self-appointed guardian of reputation and control. But this time, the stakes felt heavier. The envelope, the forged signatures, the hush money buried like bones in the family soil. "I found the old audit," he said, voice low but direct. "The ledger with the ash renewal transfers. I matched the signatures. They're not father's." Evelyn turned to him slowly, no surprise in her eyes. Only disappointment. "And you think that makes you the hero of this little story?" "I think it makes me complicit if I say nothing." She sighed, stepping forward, removing her gloves one finger at a time. "Your father was weak. He trusted people who didn't understand this world. Clara, especially. She thought kindness meant permanence. She was wrong." The name landed between them like a stone. Clara. The woman erased not by death, but by paperwork and silence. Evelyn continued, almost absently. "There are things you clean up, Charles. Not because they're wrong, but because they're inconvenient." He stared at her. "You paid her to disappear." "I paid her to stay safe." That night, Leona paced her room, notebook in hand. The torn photograph had revealed more than a scandal. It hinted at something structural. Jonas had offhandedly mentioned, days ago, that the estate's original will was rumored to have been revised. Sealed. Hidden. The last place untouched? The old office beneath the servants' quarters, now used for storage. Leona remembered it only vaguely. Damp, smelling of mold and mothballs. She took a flashlight and slipped down the back stairs just after midnight. The air thickened as she descended. Dust clung to the walls. Boxes lined the floor, stacked haphazardly. In the far corner, beneath a rotting area rug, she noticed a seam just wide enough to suggest a panel. She knelt and pried it up. Beneath, a wooden cavity lined with wax paper, and at the bottom, a document wrapped in faded blue ribbon. She unwrapped it slowly, hands shaking. Last Will and Testament of Charles Harrow, Sr. Not the version displayed in the study safe. This one was older and yet more comprehensive. It named multiple beneficiaries, including one Leona had never heard of. To Clara Wynne, in recognition of her service and dedication, I leave 20% of the estate's liquid assets to be managed in trust by... The name was smudged, but the intent was clear. Someone had buried this version. Not destroyed it, hidden it. She stood, heart racing. The will in her hand burned hotter than any torch. Upstairs, Jonas sat by the open kitchen window, sipping black coffee, watching the shadows shift over the hedges. He didn't turn when he heard her approach. "You were right," she said. "It was never about the vault. It was about erasure." She laid the will on the table. He leaned forward, eyes scanning it slowly, face unreadable. "They rewrote history," he murmured. "No, they tried to." Jonas tapped the edge of the document. "This changes everything." "Not yet," Leona said. "First, we need to prove who buried it." At dawn, Charles entered the West Wing study where Evelyn was already seated with tea, the morning paper folded at her side. "I know about the original will," he said without prelude. She didn't flinch. "You're digging into graves, Charles. Nothing good ever comes from that." Clara was meant to have a share, a rightful one. Why hide it? Evelyn stirred her tea, eyes distant. Because it was written in a moment of weakness. And weakness cannot dictate legacy. He stepped closer. You forged Father's final signature, didn't you? A pause. The kind that held lifetimes. I corrected his mistake, she said. The rage that rose in him wasn't loud. It was quiet, cold, contained. You buried the will under the servants' floorboards because even in death, you wanted her beneath you. For the first time in years, Evelyn's fingers trembled. She set down the teacup, not meeting his gaze. The room pulsed with unspoken violence. Downstairs, Leona stood in the hallway, listening to every word through the old heat vent. Her hands gripped the railing. She would give him one chance, just one. The next morning, as the estate staff prepared for the quarterly audit, Charles entered the study with the sealed envelope. He looked at the family crest on the flap. His thumb hovered, but instead of placing it in the outgoing mail, he locked it in the drawer. Later that day, Jonas found the original will missing from the hiding spot. Leona was already gone. The train whistle cuts through the morning air as Leona boards the 710 westbound, her bag light, but her conscience heavier than ever. She's not gone. She's circling, Jonas said, his eyes on the garden path where Leona once tended time and silence alike. The sun had barely lifted the fog from the Ashbourne lawn, but already Evelyn's voice could be heard slicing through the kitchen wing, tight and irate. Staff scrambled. Orders came clipped and fast. No one mentioned Leona, but her absence sat in the air like the weight of a storm that hadn't yet broken. Charles stood on the second-floor landing, tie loose, eyes hollow from another night without sleep. He had searched her quarters. The notebook was gone. So was the will. Downstairs, the fireplace roared. Evelyn never lit it this early in the season, too wasteful, she used to say. But there it was, crackling like it had something to hide. She'd burned things before. He knew that. Charles entered the sitting room uninvited. Evelyn didn't look up from her tea. You didn't even try to stop her, he said. She was never ours to keep, Evelyn answered. Did you destroy it? She raised an eyebrow. Define it. He took a breath. The original will. The one naming Clara Wynne. Evelyn sipped her tea. Clara is dead. What good would it do to drag a corpse through the court of public opinion? She had a son. This gave her pause. Barely. Charles didn't wait. And if Leona finds him, if he has documents, records, anything, this house falls. Evelyn rose. Then we remind the world that not every claim deserves oxygen. This estate has survived 2 wars, 3 recessions, and 5 generations of mistakes. It can survive 1 angry girl. But Evelyn had underestimated one thing. Leona wasn't angry. She was prepared. 2 states over, in a small brick law office nestled off Main Street in Belridge, Leona sat across from a probate attorney named Mavis Whitlow. Her briefcase rested unopened at her side. This will, Mavis said, scanning the document with a careful eye, was notarized. Unofficially, yes, but the seal is real. And if you're right about a beneficiary being omitted in the final public version, I am. Then this could be grounds for retroactive challenge, but you'll need more than a dusty document. You'll need the bloodline. Leona opened the notebook to a photocopy of Clara Wynne's birth record, then overlaid it with a birth certificate from 1987. Male, born to Clara Wynne. No father listed. His name is Miles Wynne, she said. Spelled differently, but it's her. I found school records, bank transfers. She changed towns, but not identities. Mavis nodded slowly. Then the real question is, does he know who he is? Leona looked out the window. He will. Back at the estate, Jonas found Charles in the tool shed, sorting through old paperwork. She's not the enemy, Jonas said, handing him a box. You are, if you stand still. Charles didn't answer. But inside the box, beneath a rusted wrench and 2 faded ledgers, he found an envelope marked Bell Fund. He opened it. Inside, a check stub from 1993, made out to M. Wynne, signed with a shaky hand that was not his father's. Charles stared at it, then whispered, "They paid him to stay gone." The paper trembled in his hand. The next morning, Mavis drove Leona to a modest home on the outskirts of Belridge. Wind chimes tinkled on the porch. A mechanic's truck was parked beside the mailbox. Leona hesitated before knocking. Miles Wynne opened the door. Mid-30s, strong build, grease under his nails, and the cautious eyes of someone who'd been asked for too much in life. Yes? My name is Leona Mercer. I work for the Harrow estate. I believe you're owed something, and I need your help to prove it. He studied her. That name doesn't mean much to me. It should, she said, offering him the will. It's the name that erased yours. He took the paper, frowned, then waved them inside. That night, Charles sat at his father's old desk, the check stub in one hand and a photo of the estate in the other. He was ready to speak, but not to Evelyn. Not yet. Jonas entered the study without knocking. You need to go after her, he said. If Evelyn speaks first, the narrative dies with her version. Charles nodded. The estate phone rang. Old landline, rarely used. Evelyn answered from the master hall. Her face turned gray. She's found him, she whispered. The call disconnected. Outside, wind howled across the garden, snapping a branch clean from the oak tree that shaded the eastern wing. Charles stands in the shattered library, glass on the carpet, and says aloud to the empty air, "Then I'll be the one to bring him home." The letter sat unopened in Evelyn's lap, but she already knew what it said. Morning cast a low, cold light through the windows of the drawing room. The once pristine estate now felt dimmed, like the house itself had absorbed too much history to shine anymore. Evelyn wore her usual pale silk blouse, sleeves rolled neatly, every gesture exact. But her hands trembled against the envelope as if some part of her finally understood that control, no matter how tight, couldn't stop time. Charles stood by the fireplace, no drink in hand for once, only the silence between them. She'll be here by noon, he said. I assumed as much. She's bringing him. Evelyn didn't look up. And what does he want? His name, Charles said, and a seat at the table. Upstairs, the staff moved quietly. Jonas had polished the silver, though no meal was being served. Rooms were aired, curtains drawn back. The house seemed to brace itself like an aging body before surgery. By 10:30, the black sedan rolled up the long gravel path. Leona stepped out first, hair pulled back tightly, eyes scanning the facade as if seeing it for the first time. Beside her was Miles Wynne, his hands in his coat pockets, unsure whether to look impressed or insulted. The foyer echoed with every footstep as they entered. Charles met them at the base of the stairs. He extended a hand to Miles. I'm Charles Harrow. Miles hesitated, then took it. Miles. Thank you for coming. They moved into the study. Evelyn was already there. She had positioned herself in her husband's leather chair, not the one reserved for guests. She looked at Miles without flinching. You have her eyes, she said flatly. Miles didn't smile. I have her silence too, but not anymore. Leona placed the original will on the table. Mavis Whitlow, now seated beside Miles, opened a folder. This version was notarized in good faith. It names Clara Wynne as a beneficiary and any direct descendant as eligible heir. There is no legal basis for its suppression. Evelyn lifted her chin. There is a moral basis. My husband was being manipulated. Mavis calmly replied, he was of sound mind when he signed it. And unless you wish to argue that point under oath. Evelyn's mouth tightened. This is absurd. A mechanic claiming our name? Miles stepped forward. I'm not claiming your name. I'm claiming what's mine, what my mother was owed, what your husband knew. Charles interrupted. This doesn't have to destroy us. There's enough to honor the will and protect the family legacy. But it has to come from us. Not through a lawsuit, not through headlines. Leona nodded. If you come forward willingly, make it right. There's dignity in that. Otherwise, we file. And the story becomes public. Evelyn stared at them all. Then her eyes landed on Charles. You're choosing them. He walked to her side and gently laid a hand on the chair. I'm choosing the truth. That broke something, not loudly, not visibly, but her breath caught. The weight of a legacy that had relied on silence now collapsed in a single moment of clarity. The press release was drafted by evening. Charles signed it first. Evelyn signed last. The estate would honor the original will. A trust would be established in Clara Wynne's name for her son. A public acknowledgement would follow at the annual foundation gala. Jonas watched the statement roll out of the office printer and muttered, Never thought I'd see the day. That night, Miles stood alone on the garden terrace, the wind tugging at his coat. Leona approached quietly. You okay? She asked. He looked at her, eyes unreadable. I don't want the house. I don't want their portrait in my hallway. I just want them to stop pretending she didn't exist. Leona nodded. You did that. You made her real again. Miles chuckled, dry. Funny thing about ghosts. You think naming them will quiet them, but now it feels louder. She smiled faintly. Louder means they're finally listening. Back inside, Evelyn passed the door to the eastern wing where the parlor had long been sealed off. She paused, opened it. The room was still. Furniture covered in white linen, but on the mantel, a photograph had been placed, the same one that had vanished years ago. Clara, holding a newborn, sunlight in her eyes. Evelyn stood still, then walked in. Slowly, as if returning to a room she thought she'd never need again. The fire had not been lit, but the scent of ash still lingered. She sat in the chair closest to the window, and for the first time in decades, she wept not for what was lost, but for what she had refused to see. Downstairs, Charles raised a glass in the library not to toast, but to mark a turning. Legacy had always been heavy, but maybe it was time it became honest. Miles entered the study quietly. Charles looked up. Ready? Miles nodded. Let's rewrite the ending. There are houses that remember, and Ashbourne was one of them. Its walls had absorbed generations of whispered betrayals and Sunday prayers, wedding toasts and funeral eulogies. It had stood through marriages forged out of duty, silences crafted out of shame, and heirs raised to preserve not just bloodlines, but carefully curated myths. For years, Evelyn Harrow believed that silence was strength, that control equaled love, that if you buried one truth deep enough, it could never rise again. But truths, like seeds, don't die in the dark. They grow roots, and eventually they crack through even the most polished floors. Leona Mercer didn't arrive at the estate to cause a reckoning. She arrived to do her job. To iron table linens, serve tea without speaking unless spoken to, and disappear behind doors no one remembered opening. But even in silence, Leona noticed things pages out of place, names never mentioned, expressions that changed when the past was near. She learned to listen with more than ears. She learned to wait, and when the moment came, she didn't raise her voice. She raised the truth. Miles Wynne never asked for a legacy. He never claimed the Harrow name or sought to unseat anyone at their inherited table. He came bearing the quiet kind of grief, the grief of a child whose mother was erased from memory by those who feared the inconvenience of her presence. He came not for revenge, but for recognition, for dignity, and maybe, in some impossible way, to finish a story she was never allowed to begin. And Charles, he stood in the middle. A son taught to guard what was never his to defend. A man who learned too late that loyalty to silence is not the same as loyalty to family. It takes courage to betray a lie that raised you, to let go of what kept you warm simply because it was built on someone else's exile. Charles, in the end, chose truth. Not because it made him look better, but because it finally made him whole. Evelyn, sharp and formidable, was perhaps the most tragic figure of them all. She didn't hate Miles. She didn't even truly despise Leona. She feared them because they reminded her of all the things she had sacrificed under the illusion of control. A child born of love, not scandal. A will signed in clarity, not confusion. A family that might have been bigger, more complicated, but also more honest. When she finally opened the door to that sealed eastern parlor and looked into Clara's face again, she wasn't looking at betrayal. She was looking at the life she chose to forget. This story wasn't about a will. Not really. It was about the rooms we keep locked inside ourselves. The truths we bury because we think love can't survive them. The names we erase because we fear they'll rewrite who we are. But love, like truth, doesn't disappear when ignored. It waits. Sometimes in a notebook. Sometimes in an old check stub. Sometimes in a woman brave enough to stay quiet until the moment mattered. Forgiveness, when it came, didn't look like warm embraces or tearful apologies. It looked like signatures on a trust. A chair added to the table, a name printed on a gala program, not in italics or footnotes, but in bold, rightful font. Forgiveness looked like a mechanic from Belridge standing on the Harrow lawn and not feeling like a trespasser. Legacy, as it turns out, isn't about who gets the house or the silver or the deeds. It's about what survives you. The harm you pass down or the healing you begin. The silence you demand or the truths you dare speak aloud. It's not carved in marble or etched in portraits. It's told in how the next generation walks through the door you once locked. The house didn't fall. The name didn't disappear. And the past wasn't erased. It was rethreaded, stitched together by those who refused to let absence be the final chapter. Leona didn't inherit the estate, but she inherited its future. Miles didn't become a hero, but he became something more, a living answer to a buried question. There was no perfect ending, but there was peace. And in a family like this, peace was more than enough. The philosophy remains. You cannot protect a legacy by hiding its wounds. You protect it by cleaning them, stitching them, letting them heal in the open air of truth. If this story moved you, if you believe silence shouldn't decide a family's worth, leave a number 1 in the comments below. And if you want to hear the next story, one filled with truth, dignity, and the beautiful mess of human love, subscribe to our channel. We'll be waiting to welcome you home.